Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're taking a look at shame.
Ooh, that's a heavy one.
It is.
Mhm.
It is. And I might bring up some stuff for you as we're talking about it, so just be aware of that as we go through this.
Yeah.
We're looking at Breaking the Cycle of Abuse by Beverly Engel,
Okay.
specifically Chapter 6, Learn How to Identify and Manage Your Shame. And I'm really excited to talk about this with you. It's a really interesting look, I think, at shame.
I think shame is one of those things that kind of goes under the radar. It's not something we necessarily always identify or can put our finger on,
Right.
but it's so powerful.
And she says right at the beginning that it's not just an issue for people who've been abused, but it can also be a driving force for abusers,
Oh, interesting.
which I had never really thought of before.
I mean, it makes sense in a way, doesn't it? Like that they're trying to get rid of their shame, so they're trying to put it on someone else, to have power over someone else, to make
Yeah.
themselves feel better.
Right, and that it can be this like vicious cycle.
That's
And so she goes into um, how shame kind of takes root in childhood.
Okay.
And she has some really interesting examples of things that parents will do
Uh-huh.
that can create this shame in their kids. It can be stuff that just seems small.
Yeah.
Like, why can't you be more like your brother? Or, you're embarrassing me. These little things that can really stick with us and then later on affect our behavior,
Yeah.
as adults and how we interact with other people.
That makes sense. Yeah, I could see that.
And then she brings in the work of Dr. Herbert E. Thomas,
Okay.
who coined this term shame response.
Oh, okay.
And this is basically like the way that our body and mind reacts to rejection.
Interesting.
And it can manifest in different ways for different people.
Yeah.
And so he talks about that, there's the physical sensation of it, there's chest pain, nausea. He even refers to shame attacks. And the intensity of those things are really going to depend on a lot of factors, like who is doing the rejecting
Yeah, that makes sense.
and how vulnerable that person is to rejection. And also, is it about something I did or is it about who I am?
Oh, that's an interesting distinction.
Yeah.
Mm.
And that leads us to, her explanation about the difference between guilt and shame,
Okay.
which a lot of times, they're kind of lumped together as the same thing, but she separates them out,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, and says that, guilt is about something that you did.
Well,
Shame is about who you are. And she points out that for people who have experienced trauma, choosing guilt over shame can actually be a way to have control.
okay.
Like, if it was my fault, then maybe I can prevent this from happening again.
Right. Like it's something I can take ownership of in a way that feels
Right.
like there's some kind of power
Yes,
or control.
exactly. And then she goes into how, this shame that we've been talking about can actually affect our behavior in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
She talks about how people will sometimes turn their shame into anger, and that anger can then either be just, expressed outwardly, or it can become a form of abuse.
Right.
And then on the other hand, there's people who have internalized shame,
Okay.
and that can create what's called a victim mentality. So this is where people believe that they deserve bad treatment,
Oh, wow.
and it makes them much more likely to stay in an abusive situation.
Right. So it's like that shame that they have is so deep
Right.
that it's confirming to them
Exactly.
that they deserve the abuse.
And she even talks about these people that she refers to as shame-bound individuals. And these are people who are dominated by this shame.
Mm-hmm.
They have very low self-esteem. They're defensive.
Right.
They're easily enraged by any perceived criticism.
Hmm.
And so then this leads us to all the different defense mechanisms
Hmm.
that people will use to try to protect themselves from shame. And this is where we start to see those connections to how abusive behavior can develop. One of the first ones she talks about is contempt. And just the idea that if you grow up with a parent who is contemptuous towards other people or even towards you,
Oh, yeah.
you really internalize that message that you're somehow disgusting or offensive or not worthy of love.
Right. And that can definitely affect how you treat other people.
Absolutely. And then she talks about the pursuit of power
Okay.
and how this can actually be a way of compensating for feeling inadequate.
So if I have power,
Yes.
then maybe I won't have to feel that shame.
Right. If
Oh.
I can control other people, then maybe I won't feel defective.
Right.
And this is really evident, she says, in the way that some parents exert power over their children.
Yeah.
It's not just about physical force.
Uh-huh.
It's about emotional manipulation and control
Mm.
and blame.
Right. Kind of transferring their own shame onto the child.
Exactly. You made me do this. If you were a better child, I wouldn't have to punish you.
Right. It's the child's fault that
Yes.
I'm feeling this way.
Exactly. And then she talks about striving for perfection, which, on the surface, that might sound like a good thing,
Right.
but it can actually be really, really damaging
In what way?
because you're setting yourself up for failure because no one can be perfect.
Yeah.
And so when you inevitably fail, it just reinforces that shame that you were trying to avoid.
Oh, I see. So it's that cycle again.
Exactly.
And then that can also spill into relationships.
Absolutely. Demanding perfection from your partner, from your kids, even from your friends
Right.
can be a form of emotional abuse.
Yeah.
You're just so hypercritical and judgmental.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You're pointing out every little flaw and mistake.
Okay, so we've got contempt, we've got the power, we've got the perfection. What else?
And then we can't forget about transferring blame,
Okay.
which this goes back to that guilt versus shame thing that we were talking about.
Okay.
You know how some people choose guilt because it gives them a sense of control? Well, transferring blame is taking that one step further.
Yeah.
It's saying, no, it's not my fault, it's your fault.
Mm-hmm.
So you're taking that shame and you're pushing it onto someone else.
Oh, wow.
And she says that this behavior is often learned in families where blame is the go-to response for anything.
Okay.
So no one wants to have that shame, so they just keep passing around like a hot potato.
Right.
And this can then become a pattern in their adult relationships.
Yeah.
And she talks about male batterers
Uh-huh.
as being a really classic example of this. It's never their fault. It's always the partner's fault. So they're projecting all of their shame and their rage and their inability to cope onto the person that they're abusing.
Mm.
And then on the flip side of that, we have self-blame.
Okay.
So while some people externalize blame, other people internalize it,
Yeah.
and they take responsibility for everything that goes wrong, even when it's very clearly not their fault.
Wow. That's got to be tough. I mean, if
Yeah.
you're carrying all that.
And this, again, ties back into shame because it's this belief that I'm bad,
Mm-hmm.
I'm unworthy, I deserve to be punished.
Right.
And this is really common among victims of abuse.
Yeah.
She talks about how, abused children trying to make sense of what's going on
Yeah.
will often come to the conclusion that it must be their fault.
Yeah.
If I were a better child,
Mm-hmm.
my parents wouldn't hit me. If
Right.
I hadn't done that, then this wouldn't have happened.
Right.
It's a way for them to try to gain control in a situation where they feel totally powerless.
Right.
And this self-blame is especially common among victims of sexual abuse.
Oh, wow.
They take on the shame of the abuser and think that they were somehow complicit in their own victimization.
That's awful.
It is. So we've seen how, those early shame experiences combined with these defense mechanisms can create these patterns that contribute to the cycle of abuse.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so now she's going to shift gears a little bit and talk about healing and coping with shame.
Okay.
So it's like we're moving from just understanding it to, okay, how do we actually deal with this and we manage it?
Yeah.
How do we heal from it?
And she starts off by acknowledging that it can be hard to even recognize shame in the first place.
Right.
Especially if you've spent your whole life trying to avoid it.
Exactly.
Mm.
She says a lot of people don't even realize when they're feeling shame, they'll mistake it for something else, like they're just hurt or angry or anxious. And so she really encourages people to start paying attention to their physical sensations and their behaviors and their thought patterns,
Okay.
because all of those things can be clues to what's really going on.
Right. It's about recognizing the signs.
Exactly. And then once you become aware of what your triggers are,
Yeah.
then you can start to manage those triggers.
Right. So awareness is key.
Yes.
And once you have that awareness, then you can start to work with it.
Exactly. And she talks about this important distinction between healthy shame and unhealthy shame.
Oh, okay.
And healthy shame is actually something that can help you grow. It's a
Okay.
signal that you need to maybe make amends or change your behavior or do something differently. Whereas unhealthy shame is toxic.
Yeah.
And it's based on these external judgments that make you feel like you're fundamentally flawed as a person.
That makes sense.
And so she gives some tips for figuring out, which one am I dealing with? Healthy shame is usually focused on a specific action. Like, I feel ashamed that I lied.
Okay.
Whereas unhealthy shame is more general. I feel ashamed of myself.
Oh, I see.
And healthy shame will motivate you to change.
Right.
Unhealthy shame keeps you stuck.
Yeah, I can see that.
And so then she talks about how once you recognize that you're dealing with unhealthy shame,
Yeah.
it's about learning to process those emotions without letting them completely overwhelm you.
Okay.
It's like learning to ride the wave instead of letting it crash over you.
Yeah.
She talks about breathing into the shame and accepting it as a temporary experience.
Yeah.
And then really importantly, challenging those negative thoughts that come along with it.
Right, so it's about changing how you think about it.
Exactly. So it's not just about recognizing the shame, but it's also about learning to kind of befriend it in a way,
Okay,
to work with it instead of against it.
right. Picking up where we left off last time, I think it's really interesting how we've been talking about shame and how it can manifest in all these different ways.
Yeah.
And, drive our behavior
Right.
and even, contribute to the cycle of abuse.
Yeah, I feel like we're really getting to the heart of,
Mhm.
what Engel's trying to say in this chapter.
Right.
It's not just about, understanding shame intellectually,
Yeah.
but really like seeing it in our own lives, in our relationships.
Absolutely. And those defense mechanisms that we talked about,
Right.
the contempt and the power seeking and striving for perfection.
Right.
Those are so important to understand because they're not just theoretical concepts. They have
Mhm.
very real implications for how we interact with others.
Yeah. And she goes into a lot of detail about each one,
Uh-huh.
illustrating how they can actually become these building blocks for abusive behavior. Right. It's a little unsettling,
Yeah.
but I think it's really important to see those connections.
Yeah, definitely. And let's go back to contempt for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
She talks about how when children are constantly exposed to contempt, whether it's directed at them or they witness it happening within their family, it can really distort their perception of themselves and others.
Right. They learn to see themselves through that lens
Yeah.
of being somehow offensive or disgusting
Yeah.
or not worthy of love.
And tragically, that can lead them to developing a similar contemptuous attitude towards others.
Yeah, it's like they're protecting themselves.
Right.
By becoming the bully. So
Exactly.
they don't get bullied.
And that contemptuous attitude is a form of emotional abuse in itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
So contempt is one way that those early shame experiences can manifest in unhealthy behavior.
Right.
What about the pursuit of power?
Yeah, we touched on this a little bit before, but I think
Yeah.
it's worth going a little deeper because it seems like such a common theme in abusive relationships.
Absolutely. According to Engel, that need for power often originates from this deep-seated feeling of inadequacy. It's
Yeah.
almost like a compensation mechanism,
Like if I can gain enough power,
Yeah.
if I can control other people,
Right.
then maybe I can silence that underlying shame of feeling defective.
Exactly. It's like trying to fill a void with external validation
Right.
and control.
And what's really alarming, as she explains, is that this pursuit of power isn't just about personal gain.
Right.
It's also about creating this pathway for transferring blame.
Yes.
It's a way of distancing yourself from responsibility,
Uh.
from admitting any fault or weakness.
So instead of confronting their own shame,
Right.
they're pushing it onto someone else.
Exactly. And if you think about how this plays out in families,
Yeah.
it's often the parent who wields this power over their children.
Right.
It's not always about physical force.
Yeah.
It's more often through emotional manipulation and control.
Uh-huh.
And yes, blame.
Right. And what kind of things would a parent say to a child in that kind of situation?
Oh, they might say things like, you made me do this.
Oh, wow.
Or if you were a better child, I wouldn't have to punish you.
Yeah.
It's basically putting the burden of their own emotional state,
Right.
their own inability to manage their shame
Uh-huh.
onto the child.
Wow, that's a lot for a kid to process.
Yeah, to be told that you are the reason
Yeah,
that your parent is unhappy or angry.
exactly. And it can have lasting consequences,
Yeah, okay.
for the child's sense of self-worth
Right.
and their ability to form healthy relationships.
And that brings us to another defense mechanism, striving for perfection.
Okay.
I remember this one really resonating with me
Yeah.
because on the surface, it seems like a positive trait.
Right.
You want to do your best,
Mm-hmm.
you want to excel,
Yeah.
but as Engel points out,
Yeah.
it can actually be a dangerous trap,
Okay.
particularly for people who are carrying a lot of shame.
In what way?
What's that classic? If I can just be perfect,
Yeah.
then I won't be criticized,
Right.
I won't be rejected,
Mhm.
I won't feel ashamed.
I see.
But as we all know, perfection is an impossible standard to achieve.
Right.
And so this constant striving inevitably leads to failure,
Yeah.
which ironically just reinforces the shame that it was meant to avoid.
Oh, so it's that cycle again.
Exactly. Like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, and I can see how that perfectionism could easily spill over into relationships with others.
Oh, absolutely.
You might start demanding that same level of perfection
Yeah.
from your partner,
Your children,
your friends.
even your friends.
Exactly. And when that happens, it can become a form of emotional abuse.
Right.
You become hypercritical. You become judgmental.
Yeah.
You're constantly pointing out flaws and mistakes.
It's like this pressure cooker of expectations.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I'm realizing through all this
What's that?
is that all of these defense mechanisms are really about control in a way,
Oh, that's interesting.
trying to control other people,
Uh-huh.
trying to control the environment, trying
Yeah.
to control yourself.
All to avoid that painful feeling of shame.
Exactly.
That's a really insightful observation.
It's like shame creates this deep-seated need
Yeah.
to manage and manipulate everything around us.
To protect ourselves from feeling vulnerable.
Exactly. But as Engel is showing us, those efforts often backfire
Right.
and end up hurting ourselves and other people.
Absolutely.
So where do we go from here?
That's a great question.
You know, we've explored these different defense mechanisms,
Yeah.
and it's clear that they can lead to these harmful patterns. How do we break free from that cycle?
Well, I think that's where Engel's message of healing and coping with shame becomes so powerful.
Okay.
And a crucial aspect of that healing process involves recognizing and addressing the transfer of blame,
Okay, let's revisit that.
which we've touched upon,
Yeah.
but it's worth circling back to because it's such a pervasive pattern in abusive relationships.
Yeah, it's really helpful to understand how this behavior often gets its start.
Right.
You know, Engel points out that it's often learned in families where blame is the automatic response to any problem.
Right. No one wants to be left holding the shame, so to speak.
Right. It's like a game of hot potato.
Exactly.
No one wants to get stuck with it.
So the child learns to deflect blame, to point the finger at someone else, to avoid taking responsibility for their actions.
Yeah.
And this becomes a deeply ingrained pattern that can easily carry over into adult relationships.
Right. It's like they never learned how to take ownership
Yeah.
of their mistakes or their shortcomings.
Exactly. And Engel makes this particularly astute observation
Okay.
about how this manifests in cases of domestic violence.
Uh-huh.
You know, male batterers often exhibit this extreme form of blame shifting.
Right. It's never their fault.
Yeah.
It's always their partner's fault.
They're projecting their own shame, their own rage, their own inability to cope onto the person that they're abusing.
It's like they're trying to protect their own ego,
Right.
but it comes at the expense of their partner's safety and well-being.
Exactly. And that makes me think about the opposite side of blame shifting.
Okay.
Self-blame.
Right. So while some people externalize blame,
Yeah.
other people internalize it,
And they take on the responsibility for everything that goes wrong.
even when it's clearly not their fault.
That sounds incredibly painful and unfair.
It is. And as we've been discussing, this tendency towards self-blame is inextricably intertwined with shame.
Right.
It's that deeply ingrained belief that I'm bad, I'm unworthy, I deserve to be punished.
So self-blame can actually trap someone in a cycle of abuse.
Unfortunately, yes,
Wow.
because it feeds into that victim mentality we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
that belief that you are powerless to change your circumstances and are destined to be mistreated.
Because if you believe you deserve to be abused, you're less likely to stand up for yourself,
Right.
to set boundaries, to seek help, to leave the situation.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Exactly, and it's heartbreaking to realize that this self-blame often takes root in childhood. Engel describes how abused children, desperately trying to make sense of the chaos and pain around them, often come to the conclusion that they must be at fault.
Right, like their minds are trying to create order out of chaos.
Yeah.
Even if it means blaming themselves.
Right. They might think, if I were a better child, my parents wouldn't hit me, or I must have done something to provoke them.
Yeah.
It's a way of trying to regain some sense of control in a situation where they feel completely powerless.
But it's a false sense of control
Right.
that in the long run only serves to perpetuate the cycle of abuse.
Exactly. And Engel points out that this tendency towards self-blame is particularly prevalent among those who've experienced sexual abuse.
Yeah.
They often internalize the shame of the abuser,
Really?
believing they were somehow responsible for their own victimization.
That is so devastating.
It is.
To carry the weight of that blame.
Yeah.
The shame that rightfully belongs to the abuser.
It's like they're carrying a burden that was never theirs to carry.
Exactly. And that's why understanding these patterns of blame is so important.
Yeah, right.
It helps us to see how shame operates,
Mm-hmm.
how it can distort our perceptions,
Yeah.
and how it can keep us trapped in these unhealthy dynamics.
So now that we've explored how these early shame experiences combined with these defense mechanisms can create these patterns of behavior
Right.
that contribute to the cycle of abuse, where do we go from here?
Yeah, how do we start to unravel these patterns and find healing?
That's the crucial next step.
Yeah.
And thankfully, it's where Engel shifts her focus.
Okay.
She delves into the process of healing and coping with shame, acknowledging how challenging it can be,
Especially for people who spend a lifetime trying to avoid it.
especially for those who spend a lifetime trying to avoid it.
Right. Sometimes it feels easier to just push those feelings down
Yeah,
and pretend they're not there.
I understand.
But she points out that many people are completely unaware of when they're feeling shame.
Oh, interesting.
They might mislabel it as hurt or anger or even anxiety.
So the first step is simply becoming aware of those shame triggers.
Exactly. And she encourages listeners to pay attention to their physical sensations, their behaviors, and their thought patterns.
Okay.
All of those can be clues to uncovering those hidden triggers.
Right. It's about recognizing the signs.
Yeah. Our bodies often hold on to these emotions,
Yeah.
even when our minds are trying to block them out.
Exactly. And once you become aware of those triggers, you can start to manage them more effectively.
Right.
You
right.
can choose how you respond rather than reacting automatically.
It's like we're starting to reclaim our power.
Yeah.
Instead of letting shame control us,
Mhm.
we're starting to understand it and work with it.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of reclaiming power,
Okay.
I think it's a perfect moment to transition into Engel's discussion about the difference between healthy and unhealthy shame.
Oh, yeah.
Remember how we touched upon that earlier?
Yes, it felt like such a key distinction,
It is.
but I'm not sure I fully grasped it yet.
It's a subtle but powerful concept. Healthy shame, as we discussed, can actually be a catalyst for growth. It's a signal that we've strayed from our values
Uh-huh.
or that we need to make amends. Unhealthy shame, on the other hand, is toxic.
Right.
It's based on external judgments and leaves you feeling inherently flawed as a person.
Okay, I'm starting to get it.
Yeah,
Healthy shame is like, I feel ashamed that I lied,
exactly.
whereas unhealthy shame is, I feel ashamed of myself.
And Engel offers some helpful guidelines for making that distinction.
Okay.
She explains that healthy shame is typically focused on a specific action or behavior.
Okay.
It's about feeling remorse for something you did wrong and having a genuine desire to make things right. Unhealthy shame, on the other hand, is more global. It's a pervasive feeling of being inherently bad, unworthy, or defective.
So healthy shame leads to positive change, while unhealthy shame keeps you trapped in this cycle of self-criticism and self-doubt.
You got it.
Okay.
And unfortunately, a lot of that unhealthy shame is rooted in early childhood experiences.
Yeah.
Where we were repeatedly criticized, belittled, or made to feel inadequate. Those experiences can lay the foundation for a lifetime of struggling with shame.
It's almost like those experiences plant the seeds of unhealthy shame.
Uh-huh.
And if we don't address them, they can grow and take over.
That's a powerful image, and I think it highlights why understanding the origins of our shame is so important for healing.
Yeah, it's like we're peeling back the layers to get to the root of the issue.
Exactly. And once you've recognized that you are dealing with unhealthy shame, the next step, as Engel describes, is learning to process those emotions without letting them completely overwhelm you.
Right. It's like learning to ride the wave instead of letting it crash over you.
That's a great analogy. She talks about the importance of allowing yourself to feel the shame, breathing into it, and accepting it as a temporary experience.
Okay.
And then crucially challenging those negative thoughts that tend to accompany shame.
So we're not just identifying the shame,
Mm-hmm.
but we're actually learning to befriend it,
Yes,
to work with it rather than fighting against it.
precisely. And that's a really important shift in perspective. It's about recognizing that shame is a normal human emotion,
Right?
and it doesn't have to control us.
That's so empowering.
It is.
And it makes me think about, people in our lives who might be struggling with shame and how we can offer them support and compassion.
You're so right. Creating a space of understanding and acceptance can be incredibly healing for someone who's struggling with shame.
Well, it feels like we've covered a lot of ground
We have.
in this deep dive into shame.
Yeah.
We've explored these defense mechanisms, how they can lead to unhealthy patterns, and how to start recognizing and managing shame in a healthier way.
Right.
I'm curious to hear what Engel has to say about healing, the deep wounds of shame that stem from past abuse.
That's a great point, and thankfully that's where Engel leads us in the next section of the chapter.
Okay.
She offers guidance and specific techniques
Okay.
for addressing those deep-seated wounds from the past. Shall we dive into that next?
It feels like we've been on this journey, exploring shame and how it shows up in our lives.
We have, and in so many different ways too, right?
Yeah.
From, how it how it drives our behavior, even its role in abuse.
Right. And I think Engel's approach has been so insightful
Yeah.
and compassionate.
Yeah.
She doesn't shy away from these difficult topics,
Right.
But at the same time, she offers real guidance for how to deal with it.
Absolutely.
And so now in this last part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
we're looking at how to deal with the shame from past abuse.
Yes, that's right. And she offers some really valuable insights into that process.
Yeah, it feels like this is where the rubber meets the road, you know?
Right,
It's not just understanding it, but actually healing from it.
right. How do we take this knowledge and apply it to our own lives? And she provides a really compassionate and practical roadmap for that journey.
So where do we begin? What's the first step?
Well, she emphasizes that one of the most fundamental steps is accepting the truth that the abuse was not your fault. Okay.
No matter what you did or didn't do as a child, you did not deserve to be mistreated.
That seems so simple, but I imagine it's really hard to internalize that.
Oh, absolutely. Especially for someone who's been carrying that self-blame for so long.
Right.
It's a process, not just a switch you flip on.
Right.
And to help with that process, she offers a really powerful strategy. The idea of observing innocent children.
Oh, I'm curious about that. How does that help?
It's about shifting your perspective.
Mm-hmm.
She suggests, you know, looking at a child with all their vulnerability and innocence.
Yeah.
And asking yourself, could anything this child do ever justify abuse?
Wow, that's powerful. Yeah, it really puts it into perspective.
Right. It forces you to confront that, the absurdity of blaming a child
Right.
for the actions of an adult.
Right.
And it can help to reframe those past experiences. Instead of, it was my fault, it becomes, it was never my fault.
Yeah, it's like you're reclaiming your innocence in a way.
Exactly.
Acknowledging that you deserve to be protected, not harmed. And it's not just about reframing those past experiences,
Okay.
It's also about reconnecting with your inner child.
Right. Offering that part of you, that compassion and validation
Exactly.
that maybe you didn't get.
It's about acknowledging their pain and letting them know they are worthy of love and protection.
I can see how that would be so healing.
And in addition to, reframing those past experiences and connecting with your inner child,
Yeah.
Engel highlights another crucial step in healing shame from past abuse:
Okay.
breaking the silence.
Oh, so this is about talking about it.
Yes, it's about sharing those experiences with trusted individuals. Whether it's a therapist or a support group or a close friend or a family member who can offer a safe and non-judgmental space.
Right. Because I think there's often so much shame associated with abuse
Right.
that it can be really hard to open up about it.
It is.
But I can also see how sharing those secrets,
Yeah.
releasing them from the darkness,
Right.
could be really liberating.
It is. And it's not just about releasing those secrets. It's about reclaiming your voice, acknowledging the truth of what happened, and receiving validation from others you know.
Mm-hmm.
That can be really healing, especially when it comes from someone you trust and respect. It helps to counteract those internalized messages of shame and self-blame.
So it's not just about talking. It's about being heard and believed.
Exactly.
That can make a big difference.
It can.
And then, speaking of shifting perspectives,
Mm-hmm.
I remember Engel talking about releasing the abuser's shame.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's a really powerful concept. It's recognizing that abusers often act out of their own unresolved shame.
Okay.
They're projecting their own pain and their anger and their feelings of inadequacy onto their victims.
So instead of taking responsibility for their own emotions,
Yeah,
they make their victims responsible.
exactly. And she offers this visualization exercise where you symbolically release that shame back to the abuser.
Okay.
It's acknowledging that you've been carrying a burden that wasn't yours to carry,
Right.
a burden that belongs to the person who inflicted the abuse.
Wow. Yeah, like giving it back to its rightful owner.
Precisely. And by doing that, by consciously letting go of that shame,
Yeah.
you free yourself to focus on your own healing, on reclaiming your sense of worthiness and wholeness.
Right. It's not about them anymore.
It's about you.
It's about me.
And once you've released that burden, it creates space for, I think, one of the most important aspects of Engel's work:
Okay.
replacing self-criticism with self-compassion.
I love that.
For those who've experienced abuse, self-criticism can become this deeply ingrained habit. It's that inner voice constantly pointing out your flaws and your mistakes and your perceived inadequacies.
Right. It's like that bully that never goes away.
Exactly. And so Engel encourages, her readers to cultivate a more nurturing inner dialogue, to treat themselves with the same kindness and understanding they would offer to a loved one.
Right. Be your own best friend.
Be your own best friend. Be your own cheerleader.
I like that.
And she provides some practical tips for doing that, too.
Oh, good.
Simple things like speaking to yourself in a gentle tone, focusing on your strengths and accomplishments, rather than dwelling on your perceived failures.
Right. It's about recognizing that you are worthy of love and respect,
Yes,
regardless of what happened in the past.
absolutely.
And that leads to the importance of surrounding yourself with supportive people.
Yes.
Engel talks about building those positive relationships and setting boundaries with people who are critical or judgmental or disrespectful.
Because the people we allow into our lives have such a profound impact on how we feel about ourselves.
Right.
If we're constantly surrounded by negativity and criticism and judgment, it's almost impossible to heal from that shame and to develop self-compassion.
Right.
That's why it's so important to choose, to spend our time and energy with people who nourish our souls, who see our value, who remind us of our inherent worthiness.
It's about choosing love over fear,
Yes,
acceptance over judgment, connection over isolation.
beautifully said.
And then she has this great concept of absorbing kindness.
Yes.
What is that?
It's the idea of consciously, receiving and savoring the kindness from others.
Okay.
It's about allowing yourself to feel worthy of that kindness, to let it in, and fill those empty spaces within you.
Oh, that's lovely.
It's about opening your heart to receive love and support.
It sounds like a practice of radical self-acceptance.
It is, and it's so powerful, in terms of counteracting that shame. Instead of focusing on what we perceive as, our flaws or shortcomings, we're choosing to focus on the love and the goodness that surrounds us.
That's a beautiful way to end this conversation.
It is.
We've really explored shame. We've looked at the dark side of it,
Yeah.
but we've also seen that there's this path towards healing.
Yes, there is.
And I think ultimately, Engel's message is a message of hope and empowerment.
Absolutely.
She reminds us that shame, while painful, doesn't have to define us. We can choose how we respond to it.
Right.
We can challenge those negative beliefs.
Yes.
And we can cultivate, a more compassionate and loving relationship with ourselves.
And I think that's, the biggest takeaway from this deep dive. Healing is possible. It takes courage and self-awareness and support, but the rewards are immeasurable.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into shame. And remember, you're not alone. There is support available and healing is possible.